Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out this week. Want to welcome back to the program Rebecca Traister, New York Times bestselling author, writer at large for New York Magazine, who has just written a piece in New York Magazine about the Democrats' inability to let go in many respects. This has been something that is been building, Rebecca, as you know. I mean, obviously, it came to a head during the Biden administration, but this has been around too. We even saw it with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and with Breyer.
We certainly saw it with Ginsburg, but also, I said to my editors when we first talked about me doing this piece right now, I said, didn't I write this piece about Dianne Feinstein 3 years ago? I wrote a huge feature in 2022, a long feature about the career of Dianne Feinstein and what it meant for that generation of Democratic politicians to have moved into office and then to have stayed until they literally, and at that point she was still alive, but until they were literally that died in office, which is what happened to Feinstein. And so, yes, there have, and then of course last year there was the Biden debacle. I mean, I don't even think it's arguable that it dumped us here, that an inability to step away and make room for another generation, other ideas about how to govern, how to lead, what it means to lead. I mean, it's chronological and it's also dispositional. What is the difference between people who've had power over decades and how do they view the world and their job in it and their job in Washington versus people who have been out of power for decades, in part because that top layer has been reluctant to leave. So there are all these issues and you keep thinking this is going to be the thing. This is going to be the thing that lets the party know that we've got to make room for the next generation. And then the thing happens and they don't seem to learn the lesson.
The weird thing about saying the party, it seems to me. I mean, but I do want to compare and contrast the Democrats to the Republicans. The Republicans, I mean, granted, a lot of it was scandal ridden, but not all of it, had 4 or 5 or 6 leaders in the House during the tenure of Nancy Pelosi. And, Pelosi, I will give her credit. I mean, it's sort of like a mark of where we have to give credit. In her 80s, has now said she'll step down. But there doesn't seem to be an apparatus. There's 2 questions. Why is it there's something specifically about the Democrats where, broadly speaking, the leadership seems to be unable to concede power? And then also, there's no mechanism to sort of it's a problem among Democrats, but doesn't feel like there's a HR department of the Democrats that steps in and says, hey guys,
no, but there is leadership, and the leadership that has exerted so much control, right? So you're looking at Pelosi, you're looking at Schumer, Pelosi chose and sort of groomed as her successor, Hakeem Jeffries, who is a younger politician, but who, like many of the chosen within, the people who were groomed and trained by leadership, sort of dispositionally resembles some of the attitudes, strategies, approaches of that older generation. I think you can name a couple of the other candidates who are chronologically younger than the elder leaders, but who govern and view the party in the same way and who think about what it means to interact with the opposition party and all that, Is it a kind of political moderation? In part, that's part of it. It is a view of what to do with power or whether you hold power or how you leverage power. All those things, you can see that in certain other younger politicians who've been elevated by leadership. In the meantime, younger, sort of chronologically younger candidates who and electeds who have come into the party have often been treated as the enemy rather than as the future, which is a real key difference, I think, between the Democratic and the Republican Party. And I don't want to overpraise the right here, which has done a lot of what I'm about to describe in service of an ever increasing authoritarian cruelty, demolition of all kinds of social safety networks on which millions of people rely. I mean, we don't have to discuss what the right is doing. But the one thing I will say is that the old guard on the right, and there are plenty of older Republican politicians who still have power, but they sort of saw the uprising of, in many cases, younger candidates, or in some cases, just a new generation that wanted to do things differently, more radically right-wing candidates.
Right.
And many of the older leaders, and you can look at Mitch McConnell, you can look at Tom Tillis, sort of shifted right with that in response to the up and coming generation, whether that's, you mark that as the Tea Party, or the sort of, Marjorie Taylor Greene caucus. You've seen the Republican Party move right along with its next generation of leaders who want to move ever further right. And what you see in the Democratic Party is treating the generation of Democrats who, again, I'm not sure it's just left and right. I think it's about a stance toward, do you fight or do you negotiate, right? There are all kinds of strategic differences, and it's not just about left or center. But you've seen the generation, the AOC, Ayanna Pressley, the Squad generation. You've seen it certainly around Zoran Mamdani. Right. You see it around the antipathy toward a candidate like Graham Plattner, toward more just a different approach to how we might do democratic politics. And you've seen the party actually treat that next generation as a threat to their power rather than as the generation that's going to move the party into the future and be the leadership in the future. And that is that's a structural, I think it's an error. And I think it's creating a structural problem that we're seeing playing out all over the place.
All right, let's put a pin on that structural problem for a second. So just to be clear, what we're talking about is like there's sort of like two lenses to look at the younger generation. One is from an ideological perspective. The other is from what I call just partisanship, where they understand like, hey, they have a better sense of who the Republican Party is, and they have a better sense of like how to engage with them, and that you need to fight them as opposed to sort of like constantly sort of seeking the bipartisanship. The bipartisanship was sort of the triangulation of the early 90s. And yes. There's a sense that the politicians who came in at that time, in the same way that I only listened to like the 10 years of music from like when I was 17 to 27 at this point, they learned that
100%. And I would argue it goes back before. We're talking in some cases about politicians who are in their mid or even late 80s, right? And some of them have been in political office since their 20s. Chuck Schumer, by the way, first won office when he was 23 years old. Okay. So you were talking about people who've been in politics for their entire career in some cases. And I would argue that it goes even before the 90s triangulation. Something that's always stuck with me is the Joe Biden line that he used to talk about when he first entered the Senate in 1973, January of 1973. And he was still dealing with a party where there were sort of segregationist Democrats. And he would talk about, we'd fight like cats and dogs on the floor. And then we would go back to and have lunch together. There was this sense of the people in power in Washington had fundamentally something in common. By the way, that something was power. And even though they could fight about issues, there was still, this is the valorization of civility, and weirdly, the civility always happens on the top, right. That you go to the gym with your colleagues, you have lunch with your colleagues, you drink with your colleagues, and sure, you fight about the issues. It's a sort of separation of the decision-making at the top from the lived realities of what those issues do to the people who are actually living in the world, right? So, but I would say that this extends well back earlier into the second half of the 20th century. And what we have seen is a right wing that has actually just, first of all, I think it was wrong to be so conciliatory in the 80s. Believe me, like so much of what we're seeing began with the Reagan era and a Reagan administration.
Tip O'Neill and
yes.
Reagan were buddies, and they would go. Yep.
Right. So I don't want to pretend like the Republican Party was somehow friendlier at that point. It's just that we were actually offered or friendlier to human beings at that point. They were friendlier to perhaps their Democratic oppositional peers, on Capitol Hill. But I do think that there is, for people raised in that era, in which the sort of institutionally obedient thing to do, and that was understood as somehow functional, was to negotiate, to go in with good faith, to talk to your opposition, to reach compromise. Now, we can talk about whether or not that was very bad for millions of people. I believe in many cases it was. But that was held up as a value of being in political leadership in this country. And so that is when you're talking about people who've been in power, again, sometimes from the 70s through the 80s, through the 90s, you're talking about people who still think that should be a norm, when what you're actually hearing from people on the ground whose lives have been remade by so many of these compromises and conciliations in the past is, and who are now watching the just sort of indescribable damage being done by this administration and by the Republican Party. And that means, certainly the rising costs, the unavailability of healthcare, the attempts to wrest healthcare from people, sending people onto the street mass to kidnap people from their homes. I mean, we are watching this at every level, and the idea that you would negotiate with the party that is making those choices is like from another planet for a generation of people who were not raised, in the 90s, or who came of age in an era where they were watching the Republican Party and specifically the Trump administration this time and the last time, to take out the absolute underpinnings of our democracy and our safety nets.
How is it, though, that and I know that there's been a shift in just Democratic voters' opinion about like compromising with the other side. That's changed, because I remember during the aughts when, those of us in the blogosphere would be like, why aren't you guys doing anything? And they, we could see the numbers. The Democratic voters were like, this is an important value to them, to compromise. But that's changed as far as I can tell, at least, to some extent. But why have the Republicans learned that it's a different world and the Democrats have not?
I think that's a great question. And I actually just don't know the answer. I don't know what's happening on the right that makes it. I think that there is certainly, a lot of people would argue that a lot of Democratic leadership did naturally, the people who rose within the party during the 90s and the aughts were people who themselves were perhaps more eager to compromise than some of their forebears, right? Or they became more eager to compromise as they aged. And so perhaps there's some sympathy with the center position, and what is seen as the more combative, pugilistic next generation is also identified as being more left, though again, I think that sort of fails to capture a lot of the generational difference. But yes, in many cases, you're talking about a yearning for a more progressive Democratic Party, one that is not so beholden to Wall Street, one that is not, embedded with corporate interests in quite the same way that the Democratic Party has become, and that is now considered a left position. I think it's a very, so that there's this sense that it's an attack on them, which in many cases it is at this point, an attack on the choices that Democratic leadership has made. I don't know why the right was more responsive to it. I certainly remember that the right was not initially, and then they got taken by a Tea Party. Let's remember
but Cantor gets taken out. Cantor gets taken out by, what was it, David Bratt or something like that, and loses that's the first Tea Party sort of scalp, if you will.
Yes, and it was a shock. I remember being shocked.
We were all, everybody was shocked. This was like literally, I don't know, 6 months after Cantor, Ryan, and McCarthy are on a, cover, Young Guns of the Republican Party, and they've taken over. And then within a couple of years, they're all gone.
Right.
But that happens with AOC and Crowley, and then it's the opposite. Is like this, and it's almost it was a direct mirror. Cantor, I think, was the sort of was third, I think, in line to Paul Ryan, and Crowley maybe was 2 in line, but it worked in a just completely different way.
So I would say that there's a critique that one could make, which is that people in power may be more likely to side with power. And that part of the project of the left, the very loosely construed left, right? And I'm just, the Democratic Party goes to its left,
yes.
Center, okay, has a pretty hard job in this country, which is theoretically, at its best, fighting against centralized power. So that means via, fighting for labor protections, right? Fighting on behalf of workers, fighting on behalf of, fighting against all kinds of oppressive other structures around gender and race and identity, right? And it's a combined project, right? I've always believed that there's no way that the sort of false distinctions between identity, fighting against racism and misogyny and homophobia and transphobia, and fighting against corporate interests and on behalf of workers and people who require health care and food, those things are completely linked, right? But it's a really hard project in this country, because the whole reason this fight exists is because the country was built around structures that privilege people in corporate power, that privilege white people, that privilege men, right? Like there are all these things that are the old way of doing things. And that fundamentally, when you're fighting against those kinds of structures, it's a very uncomfortable place to be in. So for a right to move right, on a lot of those things is a more comfortable move than for the Democrats to move left, making those fights much harder, right? We have a natural gravity toward the forces that built this country. And that is why for generations, for centuries, these kinds of linked struggles have been going on again, the very loosely defined left, right? And so I mean, maybe that's it. Maybe it is
on the right, it's sort of like if you can replace this guy as long as you feel comfortable with here's the new boss, same as the old boss. The problem is that is not the way that people who are supplanting power, again, center to the left, are viewing it. They're doing it to fundamentally change how that power operates and to distribute that power.
Yes, yes. And the power, remember that within the Democratic Party structures, within Congress, you have, this is part of how power works, right? Power moves to the top and then people don't want to relinquish it. That is how you have a country that's so based around corporate power, right? This is how you have a party that is resistant to, changes in how it works in terms of identity, culture, certain kinds of privilege, right? Because nobody wants to give up their power. And then you see the meta version of that happening with actual elected officials who have had certain kinds of power. And this is part of what my piece was about this week, was the very mundane, sort of aside from these broader philosophical questions about what direction is your party willing or open to turning. You also have the very basics of people who have been very used to having a voice that matters, to being able to cast a vote and feel like they matter, to being able to have staffs and take
material
trips.
benefits.
Benefits. It is hard. And by the way, I just want to say, as a human being, it is hard to get old. Okay. I think that is anybody who's had parents, anybody who themselves is aging. I actually so far have really enjoyed getting older, but I know that there comes a time it's hard. And it is also hard to give up power, which is very tied to this question of getting older and immortality and reckoning with the fact that you're not going to be around forever. And so it's not that I'm without sympathy for people who have in many cases spent decades, being used to a certain kind of life and having a certain kind of voice. I am a little bit without sympathy for those people because, one of the things is your job is...
Well, yes, there's a lot of people's lives who hang in the balance. So on one hand, we have what I think Kevin Drum would call the iron law of institutions, which is, you want to hang on to power, even if that means, you're captain of the team on the JV team, as opposed to riding the bench on the varsity team, essentially. And then the other one is, and this one I found fascinating, you really outline this in the piece, is that material benefits of the thing of you have one woman, was it Norton Holmes or Holmes?
Norton.
Yes, Eleanor Holmes Norton. The cops just found that she's suffering from Alzheimer's when she got rolled for $4,000 or something, and she's going to run for re-election. And okay, so there's this quality of okay, now I'm in my 70s, 80s, and you write, people's grandchildren have gone off to college and maybe their spouse has passed away. Now their staff is their friend circle, and also, but friends who are really, really helpful, which is, and I could totally understand.
I mean, I'm going to go further than that because they're not friends, they're employees.
Right. And they're getting,
right.
Well, then you also have a Michael Jackson sort of dynamic where it's if this guy, goes into rehab, I'm out of a job. And so we're going to keep this party going.
We know these are the symptoms of, again, what you're talking about with people who have power is you then have people who become dependent on them. They become dependent on, for example, their staffs. And that is what a former congressperson told me, observed in their memories of having served with some very elderly colleagues who certainly should have stepped away a long time ago, but refused to. In part, it's like there's nothing else because their lives have been this job, and then they have a staff in place. And as you just recounted, that staff is often, these are the people who are taking care of them in their old age because their families have moved on or grown or spouses have died. But then in turn, that staff becomes dependent on that elected official to maintain their job and their access to power. And these things happen in every industry, right? You have people at the top who have certain kinds of economic and professional power. And then you have a circle that creates this sort of closed circle of, no, you're still wonderful. You can do this. You can, or in some cases, I'm sure that there are congressional staffers, and I heard from some of them who don't think that their bosses should continue to run, but they're the ones who have the power. All of this is true, and it's human. And this is how power works. This is the Democratic Party in a moment of, not just a moment, like I believe that the fight in this country, to create stability and preserve protections and rights and dignity for more people is an ongoing crisis. We are in an ongoing crisis and have been for most of the history of this country. This is a particularly heated moment in that crisis, and so hearing about how, yes, it is hard to move on and hard to give up your staff and your perks and your power and your ability to vote is pretty alarming in the context of who is going to come next. And I want to raise one other point on this. I think that, and this is more of a touchy-feely point, amongst my peers, amongst the people I know, amongst the people I spoke to for this piece and talked to about in all my reporting, there is such a yearning to think about the future because the current moment can be deadening. And that's not just it makes us feel bad. The current moment in which Democrats have not had a lot of power. Why was last week so thrilling? Just, having a few electoral wins. It was like a reminder that there will be something else. There will be a time after this. And so, and young people and young leaders are the most tangible reminder of, look, we're going to have another generation of people. We are not going to be stuck with these same people leading us and driving us to hell, right? And with their punitive cruelty and capitulation, punitive cruelty on one side and too frequent capitulation on the other. This is not going to be our steady state forever. And so young candidates and this next generation of leadership is also just crucial on a sort of, and I think this is important politically, on an emotional level, getting people to stay out there, to stay active, to stay hopeful, because if you give in to the despair of powerlessness and this sense of powerlessness that many of us have in this particular period, then you're not doing the work of building power for the future. And that is, in fact, the path out of this moment.
Yeah, I for a while I've been feeling like I'll probably be in retirement or semi-retirement, but that future looks good as long as it's not suppressed as much.
I feel the same way, Sam. I feel the same way.
But what I also found fascinating was when Nadler, you got a quote from somebody about Nadler, where Nadler felt like he still had time to do something else. In his late 70s, God bless him, whatever. But, yes. But I also remember that, and I don't know if it was back like in the 1860s or 70s, or whether it was in at different parts of the 20th century. But one of the ways that they got federal judges out was to basically say, we're going to give you a good pension.
Yeah.
And otherwise they would hang on until they're in. There is this sort of quality of like, okay, Republicans probably have more, there's just so much more money on the sort of like ancillary parts of being a former Republican in terms of lobbying, in terms of sinecures at the Heritage Foundation, or whatever it is you go on to do. And there isn't that necessarily on the center left. I'm sure there's some, but it's not the same.
It's funny that, I didn't use this quote in the piece, but I did a lot of reporting on Massachusetts where Ed Markey, who is 79, is being challenged by us. And he's sort of a progressive hero for a lot of people. And so it's an inverse of that idea that the youthful energy runs to the left and the older politicians run to the center. He's being challenged by Seth Moulton, who is, a centrist. And somebody was talking. So I did a lot of reporting in Massachusetts, and one of my sources in Massachusetts said to me, you know, we used to have a saying that there's got to be a University of Massachusetts campus somewhere to put these guys in charge of when we move them out of political office, which speaks to exactly what you're saying, this idea that there has to be something on the other side. But actually, a point that somebody made to me in the piece is that in hanging on so long, a lot of these people on the left,
they missed their window.
They missed the window for having, so maybe it's not some fancy sinecure, though plenty of them are doing really well, and I don't even know that they need the money. But in terms of prestige, some kind of power after having served, getting the kind of, you know, adulation and having something equivalent in terms of power or authority after their political career, like, a lot of them have hung on so long that they do miss that window. And one of my sources talked about George Mitchell, the former Maine senator who went on to serve as the ambassador of Ireland. And he had retired in his early 60s from the Senate. And then was able to have a tremendous career afterwards. And I think that a lot of them sort of can't see that in refusing to retire, they're missing the window of gratitude, celebration of their career. You know, the kind of people would have them come and give speeches and teach courses and teach the young people. There's an enormous amount of gratitude. And I talked to a bunch of people for this piece who have decided to step aside in part or entirely because they believe that the next generation should take over. And one of the great ones is Tina Smith, who is retiring at, like, you know, she's basically a child at 67. And she's stepping away because she believes so much in the next generation. And she said to me that people come up to her and thank her for understanding that, you know, she doesn't have to stay in power forever.
I feel like we could get a GoFundMe just to hire like a squad of people to go and take photographs and surround like Ed Markey every day and take photographs of him just as if they're like press. But so, okay, this is an interesting sort of like juxtaposition because Markey is a senator who I really do appreciate. But we have this sort of dilemma where Moulton is not of the same ideology. He is Seth Moulton is within the context of the Democratic Party way to the right of Ed Markey, and there are natural successors to Ed Markey like Ayanna Pressley.
Ayanna Pressley instance. Is that yes,
and yet she won't jump into the race because there's this sort of frozen thing. But isn't like. And on one hand, it's like, okay, I appreciate to this extent that she has respect for this guy. But on the other side, it's like, okay, listen, you're going to have to jump. The only way he gets out is if you jump in. He may not at that point, and you may split the thing. But if Seth Moulton wins, you're not going to have an opportunity ever to take that next step, at least in that seat. Maybe you got to wait another cycle for Elizabeth Warren or something like that. But this is also incumbent, like, it's not enough to just simply say Markey won't make the decision on his own. Like at one point.
So, yeah, I don't think it's impossible that you see somebody else jump in this race. I think, in fact, it's notable. Ayanna Pressley is one of the few Massachusetts Democrats who has not yet endorsed Ed Markey. And I don't think it's impossible that she's going to get in or at least investigate it further. But it does create a difficult situation if you're talking about splitting that progressive vote. If you come in as a progressive, are you then, because I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom in Massachusetts that Markey could probably keep the seat. And if you're going to come in and split a progressive vote and then Moulton gets that seat and Moulton is much, far
way
less
to the
preferred.
Right of, yeah.
Right, way to the right. And also just, he has not exhibited, even for, a center moderate politician, hasn't exhibited greatness, I would say.
Right.
And he is young and could keep that seat for a long time if he won it, theoretically. But so do you want to enable that? It's a really bad position. And I agree with you. And I think it's very possible that somebody else, maybe Pressley herself, will jump in and that will change the dynamics of the race. And maybe it will convince Markey to step out. But I also do want to say, one of the things that strikes me so much about Markey's insistence on keeping this seat at 79, again, these are 6-year terms, right? And I know he's very healthy right now. A lot of people are healthy in their late 70s. A lot of how we get here is that we've had tremendous medical improvements, at least for people who have access to healthcare. And so it's, yeah, I'm sure he's healthy now, but 6 years is a long time. I've witnessed this
firsthand. The difference between 79 and
Yes.
85
Yes,
is not like the difference between 42 and 48 or
Exactly.
49. It is not even remotely close.
But also, let's even put a pin in what the actual physical or mental acuity is, right? He's 79 years old. He's done this job for a really long time. He has been in Democratic politics for all his life. And you know how he won last time? He had a younger challenger 6 years ago, in Joe Kennedy, right? And who was challenging him, and he was a more progressive candidate than Moulton is. And you know who saved Ed Markey? Is young people. AOC and young progressives came up and rallied around Ed Markey as an older progressive hero and helped him retain that seat. And he won that seat by like 10 points against a Kennedy, which is hard to do in Massachusetts. Historically, and
increasingly easier.
Increasingly easier. I think it's going to be much easier moving forward. Right. But, you know, the idea that young people came out for him, but that he can't even see what is it that makes somebody think that they're the only person who can do this job, when in fact, it's not just Presley. People named a ton. There are a lot of really, really good politicians in Massachusetts who are sort of ready to go for Senate seats. And what is it? Why do you need to have that seat for another 6 years at 80 years old? It doesn't track, and is a particular repudiation to that younger generation that came and worked for him 6 years ago.
And there also feels like there's a failure, because then I want to jump up to Maine. You know, like, who is the person who's not having that conversation with Markey? Like, there is a universe out there where the leader of the Democrats in the Senate is not Chuck Schumer, who is not, sort of like just enmeshed in this constant, I mean, I don't know what it is about Schumer's like sort of compulsion to not do politics in many respects. I mean, and we're seeing it in this shutdown. It was reported in the Prospect that he was sort of orchestrating this group of 8. In fact, he may have been 10. He and I would suspect Ossoff, but Ossoff realized, like, no, this does not make sense. But he's out there sort of like mentoring Gillibrand as she moves like further and further to the I don't even know what to call it, ideological, if it's right, if it's corporate capture, if it's crypto.
That's the thing. It's not exactly left, right. It's like just a center,
money.
But
it's
not
money.
even
It's
money.
It's money. It's big tech
It's money and it's power. It's money and it's power. And it's status quo. That's the
theoretically,
thing.
those two are the ones within the context of the, Democrats, Inc., as it were. Those two should be going up to Boston and go to Markey like, look, we will help you choose your successor, but you should, if you want to keep the ideological fights that you have, like, that's what should be happening. And they're clearly not doing that. And they clearly also they ignored this same dynamic in Maine, which is, I mean, just tell us about that. You're living in Maine. You've been in Maine for a couple of years now. You have long roots in Maine. Give me your perspective on what's happened with Mills and Plattner.
We would have to take an entire other hour to tell that full story. However,
we have a little bit of time.
The bare bones generationally is that it's been pretty well, it's been amply reported and documented that, Susan Collins is up for re-election. Susan Collins is a really fascinating, actually in the 2020 election, I wrote a really long feature on Susan Collins, and I think she was pretty beatable in 2020. People were livid about her Kavanaugh vote. She's held this seat for 5 terms, originally went in as a moderate, right? She and Olympia Snowe for a while were the 2 moderate Republican senators from Maine, New England, right? And she's gotten increasingly conservative, and Maine voters have become increasingly dissatisfied with her. And there was a real wave of fury in 2020 after her Kavanaugh vote and the way she behaved in the first Trump administration, where people who trusted her to be a sort of voice of practical moderation felt really let down and were very angry. Now, the Democratic Party in 2020 sort of handpicked a candidate who was young, Sarah Gideon, but she ran very much in line with the National Party, and she lost. And Susan Collins was not unseated in 2020. And so for this cycle, it was going to be a lot harder, always. It was going to be
What does
hard.
that mean to run in line with the national party?
Well, it's a bit, she was a top pick of the DSCC. First of all, Gideon was somebody who Schumer and et al. Really wanted to be the candidate. She did not stand out as a candidate in terms of how she communicated. She was exceedingly careful. I mean, this thing about what does it mean to be aligned with the party that we were just talking about? Is it money? Is it combativeness? Is it tenor? What's that thing? She was that thing, which I think was kind of careful and status quo, right?
Right. I mean, like it seems to me they pick, Chuck Schumer's out there picking somebody who he thinks is not going to cause him problems in the Senate.
Exactly. No drama, which means not just no bad drama, but also no excitement, no electricity, no like, here is who I am, no fight, no pugilism, no sense of
ability to coalesce power, no leadership skills in many respects.
Schumer wants it. Well, look, it's not to say that the big explosive fireworks it doesn't always work out, right? We have to, there are risks. Politics, leadership are risks. We take bets, right? We take bets. I took a bet on John Fetterman. It was a really bad one, right? These things happen. A lot of progressives did with Fetterman, and it worked out very, very badly. Yep. So let's not pretend that just because somebody, fits one kind of profile, we know what they're going to be like. But by the same token, playing careful just gets us the same as what we've had. So these are real questions, and questions that I think voters ask themselves all the time. Certainly journalists who are covering these people ask ourselves these questions all the time. But yes, the idea is that Schumer picked a candidate in 2020 and she was a very Schumer candidate. She kept it just 100% buttoned up, safe, didn't go out on any limbs, didn't capture the imagination of Maine voters. It was a very nationalized campaign. Maine doesn't tend to like that. Tons of people coming in from out of state. It didn't go well, and Susan Collins won. And so this year it was going to be even harder to unseat her because she is the head of the Appropriations Committee. And the big argument on, that the Republican Party has orchestrated, they're very canny, on behalf of this vulnerable Senate seat that keeps them, one additional vote in the Senate, is that they have sort of enabled her to bring money back into the state via the appropriations process. And that is the thing she promises all the time. And there are signs all over the state. This project, these jobs brought to you by Susan Collins. She is a very tough candidate to beat. Chuck Schumer decided that the candidate that he wanted to run against her is the second term sitting governor, Janet Mills, who is a very popular governor. She's hated by Republicans, but she is widely beloved by a lot of Democrats. She is a moderate, really good on a couple issues, not so great on other issues, by my lights, but she is very well liked. She is 78 years old. And if she ran and won, she would be the oldest freshman senator in history. And this is who Chuck Schumer decided should be the candidate. And he decided based on his own metrics. And those metrics have some historical merit. He likes candidates that have won statewide. In Maine, one of the big talking points about Mills is that she's the only Democrat who has won statewide in a long time. Now, that is in part because Angus King is an independent and he basically reads as a Democrat, but he caucuses with the Democrats. But he has certainly won statewide, and because a lot of the other statewide officials are appointed by the legislature, voted on by the legislature, not by. So it's a little tricky to say she's the only Democrat who's won statewide in a long time, but it's also, it's true.
Yep.
And that is a metric that historically, if you won statewide, there's a greater chance you're going to win statewide again. But that really changes when you're talking about somebody who is coming up on their 80s, when you're talking about a state that I want to say something about the voters in the state. They're really sophisticated voters, in part because as a small state that does require robust representation in order to bring money in, to get equal representation, Maine voters are pretty well versed in terms of how the Senate works around seniority. That's one of the things Susan Collins has always had going for her, is that she can talk about what it means to be senior in the Senate and have it resonate with voters. And voters understand also what it means to send a 78-year-old to a Senate seat who says up front she's only going to hold it for one term and isn't going to be able to have that level of seniority.
She's going to be a freshman senator, even though she's not going to necessarily have the freshman sort of energy per se.
Right. Well, and that puts you back at ground zero. And that's going to happen with whoever comes in to fill that Senate seat after Collins, whether it's this time, whether it's next time. That happens when you elect a new senator. But I think that there is a sort of awareness that, in part born of Collins' career, that like what it means to gain seniority in the Senate for the state that you represent is actually meaningful. And so I think that's a real question that's being had around the Mills candidacy.
That's interesting.
And her argument that she made to me, I went and I talked to Janet Mills, your thing about who says these things to these people. A lot of people are actually saying to Janet Mills, tell me why you're doing this. And I had that conversation with her directly. And to her credit, she was very willing to have the conversation and make the case as to why she was making this choice. And she views this moment as a particular emergency, right? And she says, it's just 6 years. It's just 6 years. And we know I can do this in the state. We know I can win this. I don't think it's settled that she can win it. I think in part, some of the polling that happened. So that, the other thing that happened is that a candidate came up this summer, Graham Plattner, an Oysterman from the Mid-Coast, with a very left populist message. And the enthusiasm for him here in the state, and I say this both as somebody who lives in the lefter-leaning downstate region and whose family is from the more conservative rural region up north, and I spend a lot of time there and have many, many connections there. The sort of fever for Graham Plattner was pretty extraordinary through this fall. And in fact, he was polling in the first poll that was done, he was polling 34 points against Janet Mills, and Janet Mills is like a well-liked politician.
And we should say, like with Mills, in terms of that, like I've seen polls at the beginning of the year, it was 50-50 on her likability, or I should say approval. Maybe it was like, was in with the margin error. Maybe it was a point down. And then I think after her confrontation with Trump, it seemed to be closer to like 50-40 in terms of her popularity. Mm-hmm. Where is it's interesting because I hadn't heard anything about the sophistication around seniority. And we should say,
that's my perception based on having reported on Collins in the past and talking to just voters.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I think the idea that like you're going to do one term means you don't even begin to build seniority for 6 years. Right. Yes. Like you're still 6 years out from like, essentially it's like almost like refining your mortgage you're only paying interest essentially for the first, you're going to do that 2 times in a row. How much of what Plattner's doing now that she has entered the race, because he had basically the floor for, himself for 4 or 5 months. How much has the sort of like controversy around the Reddit and the tattoo and that, how much has that dampened the enthusiasm from your perspective? And how much is he leaning into that concept of like, her age, she's going to be the oldest person to ever enter the Senate as a freshman, and B, the implications of that in terms of seniority and delivering from Maine, 12 years out or so. And see, like, just how much is that, and where's his enthusiasm at this point?
Okay, so a bunch of different questions there. In terms of so there have been, as soon as Mills got in the race, like within 48 hours, there were a lot of stories that dropped about his history of bad comments on Reddit, sexist, racist, homophobic comments on Reddit. And then, a story that he actually wound up telling himself, but because it was being shopped by somebody to other media outlets, about the fact that he had a tattoo that looked like a Totenkopf, a Nazi symbol that he got when he was in the Marines, which he says was never the intention of the tattoo. And it's not worth delving into all of that right now, except to say
we've talked about it ad nauseum. I will tell you that.
Right,
we have talked about it quite a bit on this program.
Everybody has. And it's like, it's endlessly fascinating to me because I'm living here in the midst of it and have a lot of opinions about it. But also I feel like every time everybody's just talking about it so much that I'm like, shh, I just need to not talk about it for a few minutes. But anyway, I can't say there hasn't been super recent polling. There's only polling from right around the time of the scandal. So I can't say with a kind of polled authority what the impact of that has been. I can only say it, and this is literally about like looking out in my neighborhood and talking to my friends who are further up north and having been to the coast. I have not yet observed any measurable dampening of enthusiasm for Plattner, which is not to say that people are happy to take on a little racism, sexism, and Nazism with their progressive politics. It's that they do not believe that those stories reflect who this person is right now. And again, I haven't seen the polls. Maybe we're going to see a huge dip. I have no idea. But I can tell you anecdotally, and this is pretty like my everyday lived life anecdotally, that I have not heard from people here in any significant numbers that they have changed their view of Plattner or what he stands for, which in their mind is not only a sort of economic progressivism, but an anti-racism, protection of LGBTQIA people, feminism, right? Like, I mean, I'm hearing from people who are activists, and so far that it has not yet altered their vision of who he is. That is anecdotal. It is not polled. Okay.
And I would presume you're in, to the area that you're primarily, as opposed to a reporting, getting that anecdotes, you're probably in the part of Maine that would be theoretically most sensitive to those questions.
Yeah, and I'm talking to a lot of people who are activists on these issues. Again, and I'm living here. I am also a reporter. I expect at some point I will write on this race at length. I am not currently writing on it at length. And so I've been in a sort of half human being, half reporter mode where I am talking to everybody all the time. I did, when I was writing this generational story, I was reporting it thinking that Maine was going to be a bigger part of it. And I was doing reporting with voters for several weeks through those scandals. And then it became clear that that was going to blot out the rest of the piece. And so we brought it back to just Mills. But so I have actually been working as a reporter here too, talking to people about this. And yeah, again, I don't want to say there are no defectors. There certainly are. I've talked to a few. But the vast majority of people who I have spoken to so far up to this point, and we don't know what else is going to come out about Plattner. I mean, one of the things I write, and I think this is really important, I think there was some hope from Plattner supporters that Mills wouldn't even enter the race because he had gained so much traction. He did so many town halls. He met so many people in person in the period between his entering and her entering. And there were Plattner signs everywhere in the state. And it's very more than a year before the election. That's very rare to see this level of excitement, hundreds of people gathering for these town halls. And I think there was hope that maybe Mills wouldn't even get in. I write in the piece, and I really believe this, I'm so grateful, no matter what your politics are, that actually she did, because this stuff that came out about him, whatever you think of it, was really important to get out there, right? This is one of the things about a new generation. It's going to come out one way or another. Yes, and it is absolutely true and fair to say that with a generation of new candidates coming into the public space, we've talked about it before, there are big risks, and you need to and these people aren't necessarily tested. They aren't necessarily vetted. And I don't think that should be disqualifying. I don't think that means that you can't have them run. I just think that it's good when they do run, you got to get some practice. And this is going to put Plattner through his paces, and better now than a year from now, if you are somebody who cares about Graham Plattner's prospects. So I think it's good that Mills is in the race. And I just don't know. We'll see what we don't know if there's more out there. Again, we don't, there may be more oppo. We just don't know. But as of now, based on what's out there now, what I have heard is that there is still a view of Plattner as a candidate who a lot of people who care very much not only about the economic issues, but also about the very issues that the oppo would seem to undermine. They still are excited about this guy. And I want to say something about the other question you asked. He's doing something really smart and interesting. He's not really going after Mills directly. He's going after Schumer. I'm not saying he's not being critical of Mills. He is here and there. I think this is very smart because she is well liked by a lot of the same people who are supporting him. He is not making her yet, that I've seen, his opponent. He is making Chuck Schumer and the Democratic Party establishment his opponent. And, you can tell Mills was very eager to me to emphasize that Schumer had not talked her into getting into the race. She says this was not about Chuck Schumer. This was my decision, in part because I think she knows that that Schumer party establishment brand may not be very winning with a lot of Maine voters. And, you know, and I
That's
think
a different question as to whether Chuck Schumer was able to sell her on running, which is, I mean, I don't have faith that Chuck Schumer could sell, could sell much, but I'm sure part of her equation was, I'm going to have the backing of Gillibrand and the DSCC and Schumer and whatnot. And that's, and I would be surprised if there wasn't sort of also this notion of like, in the same way, like, there may be somebody in Massachusetts who doesn't want to run against Markey and be, and allow Moulton to win and then have to go back to the progressive community and be seen as a spoiler. I would imagine there's also sort of like apparatus in Maine who are part of the Democratic mechanism, who also are like, I've got to, weigh 10 years from now, am I going to have a job in Maine politics if I go with Plattner, versus go with Mills? She still loses. I still, probably my prospects are better. I mean, that calculation has to happen, I would imagine.
The calculation does have to happen. It's interesting, though, the calculation has to happen. And I want to be really clear that she does have mechanisms already in place for her. And her argument to me, which is that the party didn't have anything to do with her decision to run, is really compromised by the actual choices Schumer made and Gillibrand and the DSCC by the day after Mills gets into the race, they announce a joint pack with her, right?
Well, that's
on
the
her
thing
behalf.
that I find so amazing about this. There's another part of this story, which is these guys are incompetent. Right. You telling me
it would have been so much better for her prospects for them to just stay out of it. And also the stuff about,
how is it that there is not another, how do they not find, I know there's another candidate in the race.
There is Jordan Wood. There are a couple others. Yeah.
Jordan Wood is associated with one of the biggest scandals that obviously we don't have too much time to cover. Although we did interview someone from the mothership, which was like this sort of scam PAC thing. And he was associated with Citizens United PAC, which, it's unclear where that money went down a hole. But with all that said, like, how is it that the DSCC, who is charged with finding, like, even on their own terms, I wouldn't necessarily like their candidate, they can't find somebody who in this unique moment, your whole piece is about this. Like, there couldn't be a more sensitive time than to run the world's oldest freshman senator.
Well, I think this is a lot about, it goes back to this thing you and I keep circling back to, which is power and the centers of power, and that you may be near all that authority, money, whatever it is that's, so addictive there, but you're really separated from that. Like, the longer that you're at the center, the more distance you have from the margins, but the margins happen to be your voters in a lot of cases, right? And so I don't get the feeling that there's like a great national understanding. I'm sure this is true in states all across the country. I just happen to be living in this one, right? I don't get the feeling that there is a great view of this state coming from the national party. I don't think that there's like a real sensitive feel for what it's like on the ground here. I do want to speak slightly to the idea that they could just get somebody else in there. I want to say that the excitement around Plattner is really unusual, and he's a very unusual candidate. It is not, and this is something Michelle Goldberg wrote in her piece about Plattner a week or so ago, like the fantasy that you could just bring in another candidate like a Not Mills who could knock out Plattner is its own kind of fantasy too, because, and again,
Oh, I don't think they could
statement.
find somebody. I mean, I think he's a unique
He's a
talent.
very unique talent. Now, that doesn't mean, again, we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know, and I don't want to. But the excitement he's creating here is not anything I could have predicted when I saw his first video getting into the race in August. I had no idea what it was going to feel like to have this guy on the ground and to watch everybody I know, like asking questions, going to town halls, more than a year out from election.
Right.
That is not something that a party apparatus can produce on command. Those are candidates. And again, I don't want to say this with some prediction that he's going to win. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what else we're going to learn about him. I don't know how he's going to fare as a candidate going against Mills or Wood or anybody, or against Collins. So I'm not making some kind of prediction of victory. But what I am saying is that you have candidates sometimes who come out of nowhere, and they are truly it's an AOC, it's a Mamdani. People, you can't make that. You can't.
Right.
And I think that's true. And that doesn't mean that those candidates are always going to win and they're always going to be on the side of good. I'm really not trying to do like a Graham Plattner ad here, but I am saying that there is an unusual thing about this particular candidate who Mills and Schumer find themselves up against in Maine, and that it's not something that the party itself could have simply produced on command.
And I am of the mind, as someone who is, spoken in support of his campaign. And again, we don't know everything about him, and there's times you get burnt, of course. But this primary is going to have, I think on some level, Mamdani inspired his campaign. Probably also like some people maybe associated also went up there and worked a little bit on it. Not in maybe a determinative way, but just the existence of somebody who wasn't expected to win, to be able to win and to knock off someone like Cuomo empowers other people to realize, think broader about their possibilities. I think the implications of Plattner, if it goes this way, beating Mills and then beating Collins, and from this distance, it really looks like he has a better opportunity to beat Collins than Mills does, because I don't understand what the value proposition of Mills versus Collins is beyond in terms of how they've distinguished themselves as, it's really just like, I'm a Democrat. I will vote, but it's also associated with Schumer, who I don't think is terribly popular amongst Democrats. The implications of him winning, I think, will reverberate in a much greater way across the country, because a guy like Plattner undercuts sort of like Schumer and Gillibrand's perspective on what's going to win. And we're already seeing that cracks. We're seeing it even in Michigan on some level. We're seeing it with senators, come out, Heinrich supporting Plattner, Schiff going to Michigan and sort of like looking into the non-DSCC candidates. I think it's going to be a big deal. Rebecca, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this piece. I think it's been something that, everybody has been feeling, and it's fascinating to see it all sort of like wrapped up in that bow.
I appreciate you having me. And I just wanted to tie your last comment about Plattner, Mamdani, AOC together. This piece that I wrote is about the older generation. It's looking specifically at that older layer. And I think one of the things that maybe we're coming to is that there's a lot of waiting for them to do the right thing, and in fact, some of the people from Jerry Nadler to Tina Smith, are stepping aside in part to make room for young people. But I think we're also looking at, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, it's going to be the young people who come and knock it down. And I don't mean just chronologically young. I mean like the next generation that understands democratic leadership in a different way and strategy in a different way is actually going to come and force the issue. And it's not always going to be a matter of the older generation acknowledging that it's time to move aside. And, regardless of what happens in Maine, I think we're seeing that in lots of instances around the country.
Yep. Power does not give itself up willingly. Yep. Rebecca Traister, we will put a link to your piece in New York Magazine. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.